For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alistair Tudor. I'm the Operations Manager for Somerset Chamber of Commerce. I think this is webinar 49, I think, that we run since the middle of March. So we've all learned a lot about how to do this, but I think the good thing is that we've been able to disseminate via our expert members like Albert Goodman and Clarke Willmott and Kate and Tracey some really useful information to you as members and as businesses in Somerset. So I hope you found them all useful. This obviously is a webinar around the changes to the furlough scheme. I think we're all fairly up to speed on what we've got at the moment and what the scheme covers, but there are some key changes that are coming in via the flexible furlough scheme. And I think Tracey and Kate are obviously going to cover a lot of detail on that. There are some areas that we still need clarification on, and Tracey will cover those as well. That's all good information to keep an eye out for as well. We'll be sharing the slides after the event. Tracey has run through a lot of the details, so we'll share those and make sure that you've got copies of those, as well as contact details for Kate and for Tracey. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping, we do tend to mute everybody whilst the speakers are speaking, just so that there's no background noise from anybody else. Just make sure that everyone has the best opportunity of hearing what Tracey and Kate have got to say. If you can use the chat function for any questions, what we'll do is at the end of the webinar, we'll run a Q&A, and I'll host that with Tracey and Kate and hopefully get some clarification on any questions that we've got. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Tracey Watts from Albert Goodman. Tracey, over to you.
Thanks, Alistair. I know you said that I think that we're all pretty much okay with the current scheme. I'd have to say that that's not necessarily the case, and every day we're still getting fresh queries from clients. It's just amazing how many different scenarios there are when you're running a payroll, which obviously filters into the claim process. And you know, even with the most imaginative person writing HMRC's guidance, they just can't foresee all of the situations that come up. So this does make it an incredibly difficult area to be advising clients on. So whilst we're all sort of familiar with what we're doing, that's all set to change. And so we'll be running through some of the detail this morning. So can I just have the next slide, Alistair? The next one. Okay, so this is what I intend to talk through this morning. I'll just give a very brief update on where we are with the job retention scheme and some very important dates as that scheme comes to an end at the end of this month. We're then moving into a new scheme period, the flexible furlough scheme, and we'll look at some key points. There is a fact sheet that was issued on 29th of May, and that is all the detail we have at this point. But with a little imagination, I've come up with an example as to how this might work. There are some key conditions that you need to be aware of to be able to benefit from the new scheme, and so urgent actions may be needed under the current scheme. There's some changes to the claim process, then we'll look at accounting for the grant income, and then at the measures that are coming in to safeguard any overclaims. Okay, next one. Right, so we have it typically on a Friday. We'll get some more information, more changes coming out. The guidance is constantly being updated for the current scheme, the job retention scheme. You may recall that there was a direction that was issued some time ago now in April that contradicted some of the guidance that the Revenue had published. And so the direction was reissued. It was dated 20th of May, but actually issued on the 22nd. And it took away some of the differences between that, the first version of the direction and the Revenue's guidance. In particular, it clarified that you can move people between furlough and sick, So that might be useful to do to increase an employee's pay whilst they're off sick with the virus. And in particular, something that we had so many queries on in terms of directors furloughing themselves, particularly from small companies, is that they are able to continue making payment of wages and claiming under the furlough scheme whilst they are furloughed, because before it wasn't clear whether or not that would be regarded as work, so they couldn't be furloughed. It also clarifies that furlough agreements where you're confirming with staff that they're furloughed, they now have to be retained until June 25, although the guidance does say keeping records for 6 years. So no doubt as we come under the new scheme, which will run to the end of October, that deadline will further extend. So I would just generally keep all records for 6 years anyway. The next change is that we've got the flexible scheme that was announced with some detail on 29th of May. That will enable employees to work flexibly and furlough flexibly from 1st July. Another main change is that the government will be withdrawing their support from the scheme, and that will start from August. Although actually, if you're bringing employees back from July, you'll obviously be paying their wages. And then finally, the scheme will end at the end of October. There have been various updates to the guidance. One main update was that they've sort of bulked out the definition of the non-discretionary payments and the definition of overtime. I have to say, from my perspective, that's still unclear, and maybe Kate can comment on that later. They've also confirmed that all staff continue to accrue holiday rights whilst on furlough, and if they do take holiday whilst on furlough, then they have to be paid at their normal wage rate. And again, that can be a very complicated process working out that calculation. And very recently at the weekend, the guidance was updated again. Actually, it was Friday night, the guidance was updated again to provide that if you have overclaimed in any prior period, there will now be a new box in the claim portal for you to enter the overclaim, and then that will adjust it down so that you are only then receiving the net amount. Unfortunately, it doesn't give any provision for what you've done if you've underclaimed in any period, and so there's no guidance on that at all. And so I would still be recommending that actually you're looking to update it as you're running each payroll. But again, the guidance on that may change at a later point. And then we've got the big change, the new scheme, the flexible furlough scheme, with the real detail on this coming out this Friday. No doubt if it follows suit, it will be in the evening as we're all just about to log off. Right, next one, please. So the job furlough, the job retention scheme, the current scheme will end at the end of this month. That means that all claims will run to the end of June only. So you will have to split this claim period if you've got any payroll periods that straddle a month. So under the retention scheme, we've got many clients who have been got different payroll dates. They might straddle a month, but you've just put the start date of the claim and the end date of the claim, and it doesn't matter that you're running over the month end. That will end. Got two separate schemes, and we'll come on to the claim process in more detail shortly. Tomorrow is a really critical date. If you have not furloughed anybody before and you want to make use of the flexible furlough scheme, you have to have made a claim under the job retention scheme. So you have to have furloughed your first employee by tomorrow. That's the last time you can furlough somebody and get them to get their qualifying 3-week period under the job retention scheme. Again, if you haven't furloughed, so not only if you haven't used the scheme at all, you need to be furloughing from tomorrow, but also if you haven't furloughed a particular employee where you might want to make use of the flexible furlough scheme, then again tomorrow is your last opportunity to furlough that individual, and they will have to be off work for 3 weeks to the end of the month. What's not clear is we've seen a lot of staff were furloughed at the beginning. They've begun to come back into the workplace, but the level of activity isn't quite there yet, and they've been re-furloughed since. It's not clear if you can re-furlough after the 10th of June so that their next furlough period is less than 3 weeks. It's been made clear that under the new scheme, there's no minimum amount that you have to furlough somebody for, but it's not clear where we go into this sort of phasing period where you don't get the full 3 weeks left at the end of June. So hopefully there'll be more detail on that. 30th of June, there are a lot of businesses reportedly who have not even made their first claim under the retention scheme, even though they've been furloughing staff. So they might not have had that urgent need for cash. You need to make your first claim at least by 30th of June. And then all claims for the rest of the furloughing period under the job retention scheme have to have been completed by the end of July. Again, we don't know about what we do about amendments. If we're still going back revisiting calculations, can we make any changes after 31st of July? And as I said just now, at the moment, the Revenue have only given guidance on what you do where you might have made an overclaim rather than an underclaim. Have the next one, please. So end of June, the job retention scheme will end and we'll have the new flexible furlough scheme. And it's really aimed at kick-starting the economy and helping businesses to return to some kind of normal. And as we all transition into the new way of working. All through the job retention scheme, there's been a call for part-time furloughing because there has been some work there, but not enough work to keep somebody engaged full-time. So this is the measure. It's a new scheme that will come in from 1st July. And we will also see the government's help being phased out. So there's no actual cliff edge, but the scheme will finally end at 31st of October. And again, different sectors don't think this is fair because some are more adversely affected than others. So now moving to the detail of what little we do know. 1st of July, the start of flexible furloughing. Now you can agree a new working pattern with anybody who's either on furlough, you want to bring them back into the workplace, or where they have previously been furloughed under the job retention scheme. So the first change is that you are, of course, going to have to pay for the hours that they work, and that has to be at their normal contracted rates, and Kate will talk some more on this later. You also have to pay all of the national insurance and pension costs that go with those hours worked, and some employers have been topping up any furlough payments. You can, of course, continue to top up if you wish to do so, and you'll be responsible for all of the additional costs on there. The support from the government will sort of remain unchanged. That is that the headline amounts of 80% of your normal wages, capped at 2,500, plus the employer's NIC and pension will remain, but that's only for the usual hours that they are furloughed for. So it's not a complete top up in addition to the hours worked. We've got no guidance on what those usual hours are, and I can see that this is going to cause a lot of complication in the calculations going forward. We then move to the 1st of August, And again, you are paying all your staff for all the hours they're working at their normal contracted rates, plus the employer's NIC and pension costs, any top up you want to do. And this is where the first change comes from withdrawing of the government support. So now you will also be responsible for paying all of the employer's NIC and pension costs on the furloughed hours that the government are paying for. So the government will then just be paying the 80% of normal wages, capped at 2.5 of the usual hours that they are not working. Then we move on to 1st of September. Next slide. Again, pay for work hours worked, NIC, top up, your NIC and pension on the furlough amount. And now the employer has to pick up 1/8 of the government support, so 10% of the usual hours, capped at £312. And then the government support reduces from that 80% and that 2,500 down to 70%, capped at 2,187. So again, that's only for the usual hours that they are now furloughed for, so there will be a prorating there. And then finally onto the scheme as it will be in October. So now all as before, but this time the employer is now contributing 20% of the usual hours that are furloughed, capped at 625, and the government support has now fallen from 80 down to 60%, which gives a cap at 1875. So throughout all of this, the employer will still have to pay holiday at full rates, and any hours that are worked have to be paid at least the national minimum wage rate, bearing in mind that that rate changed in April this year. So that all looks quite nice and straightforward, and it's captured in a nice little table on the government website, but in reality I can see this is going to be an absolute nightmare. Now I've come up with an example, and this is about as simple and basic one that you're ever going to see, and it bears no semblance of what the reality is going to look like for those running payrolls and submitting claims. So we look at John. He was furloughed in March, so his normal pay, his reference pay in February was £2,000. He's a salaried worker. Let's keep this simple. So he's been furloughed since the beginning of March. He's been receiving 80% of his pay. In June, the job retention scheme, that's going to continue. He's still on furlough. He's getting 80% of his pay. You've got the NIC costs, the pension costs, that's all being met by the government. So at the bottom, there is no cost in June to the employer for keeping John on furlough. In July, he's going to be bought back 50% of his time. So for the 50% of the time that he works, he has to be paid at his normal rate of pay. So that's 50% of what he would normally get, being £1,000. 50% of his time, he's going to be on furlough. So we half the furlough pay. Then the bit in pink where we've got the employer's NIC and the pension cost apportionment, that is completely made up. We have no detail how this apportionment is going to work. Before, furlough worked on the days that you were on furlough. There are unlikely to be any days that people are on furlough. If you remember, it was on a calendar day basis. We're now looking at working time. So the apportionment I've taken there is simply splitting that prorated between the pay elements. So 800 out of 1800 goes to the government, and the balance goes to the employer. Completely fictitious. Do not take this as you're working when you start doing your payroll in July. That detail will follow at the end of this week. So July is going to be the headache, because that is where we're still splitting the NIC and pension costs. August it gets slightly
Going to stop the share for a moment. I think Tracey's connection has dropped out, unfortunately. Can everybody still hear me? Just nod. Yep, okay. So I think Tracey's might have dropped out. Kate, I might throw you into the mix to pick up a few elements, if that's all right, whilst we've got a moment and we wait for Tracey's connection to come back. I'll just unmute you, Kate. There we go. Right, Kate, you are unmuted. Not sure what's happened with Tracey's connection, but what I'll do is I'll run forward sorry, I'll run back to Tracey's slides when she's back on with us.
Okay.
But in the moment, I'll put you on speaker view and let you do your pieces, if that's okay.
I'll do my. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Good morning, everybody. 49 webinars, wow, and you're not looking a day older, Alistair. That's all amazing. I think as far as I'm concerned, my hair seems to have grown a foot, but apart from that, lockdown isn't so bad when you're a lawyer at home. The JRS, the Job Retention Scheme, it seems a long time since it but I did think, I know a lot of what Tracey has said, there will be a little bit of repetition, but with an employment angle from my point of view. So I thought it might be helpful just to recap what was the point of that introduction of the coronavirus job retention scheme, and that will help us to understand what's happening next, and then how we handle our employees through that. So it was provided by the government to provide relief for employers who could not maintain their current workforce due to COVID-19. So that was the shutdown of all those shops and cafes and restaurants. Do you remember when we used to go out of an evening in a group? Those were the good old days. And those businesses were so badly affected that the government had to come up with something to keep some economy. So the furlough was a whole new concept, as I think I've said to many of you before. It comes from the Dutch word verlof, which was Dutch soldiers having some time off, and it allowed employers to reclaim wages. But the big thing was they had to be on the payroll, and the dates changed, but basically we ended up with a date of the 19th of March. Very important thing to bear in mind with employees, and there was a lot of hoo-ha at the beginning of this, but you do need written consent from those employees, and that's a thread that runs through this, and will run through the changes that are coming up through the rest of this month, July, August, September. As lawyers, we love things in writing, and believe me, it will help you massively if you ensure you do have written consents or even email consents from your employees whenever you impose a change, because these are fundamental changes in their contractual terms. And they may be happy to take your money and that of the government now, but in a few months' time, they'll all be lining up to go to the Employment Tribunal for unlawful deduction of wages claims if you don't have those consents. So that's my word of warning. And as Tracey's already said, keep those consents, keep that paperwork. We were first told 5 years, 6 years is the wise time period, because that's the period when HMRC could come back to you. And potentially there are breach of contract claims as well here. So again, keep that paperwork, those emails well stored. The minimum period was always going to be 3 consecutive weeks. And again, these time periods are changing. And we know what you could claim for, 80% up to 2,500 per week. And Tracey has gone through how those limits will change and how the government is now planning to gradually reduce those contributions, and employers will have to top up those contributions over the next period up to the end of October. Probably we've gone a week too early on this webinar, but then we are not readers, and my ball isn't working very well, so I didn't know that the government were waiting Friday, as Tracey says, until we're all gasping for that glass of wine on Friday night. They suddenly issued the next set of guidance, so that's when we will be told some real detail about the flexible working that's coming up, which is going to be so useful to so many employers. But we won't have real detail on that until this coming weekend. But it's okay, because the summer's going to end tonight and it's going to be raining, so we're all going to be inside anyway, so that will be fine. As Tracey has said, it's now about to be an end of an era. 30th of June, that marks the end of JRS Mark 1. So that's the end of the current scheme. 1st of July, new scheme. And the scheme will close altogether to new entrants from the 30th of June. So that's no new employers and no new employees either. And as Tracey said, tomorrow's the big day, 10th of June. That's the final date that you can furlough one of your employees for the first time, and you've got to do it for 3 weeks up to the 30th. So whatever you do, crack on with that. If you want to use the furlough scheme for any of your existing employees, and it could be extremely useful if you haven't yet furloughed those individuals, but you want to use the furlough to enable them to work part-time from the 1st of July and use the government top-up for the times that they're not working. The other part of guidance which we do have is that you will still be able to use the furlough for any employee that has been furloughed at any time since the 19th of March. So if you've got people, you might have employees on a rotating scheme who've actually been working for several weeks now, but if they were originally furloughed at any time, they can continue, and you can draw them back into the furlough scheme. So you could draw them back into the part-time furlough arrangements from the 1st of July. So that could be very useful to know as well. But the overall guidance is the maximum number of employees that you are furloughing cannot grow from the end of June. So the maximum number of furloughed employees can be no more than you claimed for prior to the end of June. So that's the, can be different people, but that you can't exceed that maximum number. So there's the cap there. Flexible furlough, yep, begin from the 1st of July. Great news for many, bit of work going on, don't know how much. They are keen to bring people back in and have some sort of normality. So you will be able to bring employees back in part time. The employers pay all the hours they work, and then the furlough pay scheme can be used for the difference between worked and unworked. As Tracey has mentioned, well, what are normal hours? Well, my view will be what they were working prior to the 19th of March, full-time or part-time, whatever those employees were, and I think that's all we've got to go on at the moment. There may be some more guidance from the 12th of June, but normal hours will be what they were working before. If they were working flexibly, then again, the general employment law says do an average of a 12-week period. So that's probably what you're going to go with on working out normal hours. So hopefully that is some help and steerage at this time. That may change from the 12th of June. Again, I think as Tracey mentioned, with this new flexible furlough period, you can't be changing hours around every day for individual workers. You're going to have to set minimum periods of 1 week. So it's not 3 weeks, it's 1 week. So you can use that flexible scheme a week at a time. So again, I think this is going to be really useful to businesses who are keen to get back in there. I'm just going to run very quickly through the government contribution, but really I think you've got that now. Key dates, as we've said, 10th of June, that's the last date for first-time furloughers. 12th of June, we get some more guidance. 30th of June, Mark 1 JRS closes. 1st of July, new flexible furlough, the whole new world. 1st of August, government still pays 80% and up to 2,500 cap, but you, the employer, pays the national insurance contributions and pensions. So that's the beginning of employers' contribution. And then it winds up 1st of September, government goes down to 70%, top rate 218,750. You, the employer, has to pay extra 10% plus NICs and pensions. 1st of October, government goes down to 60%. You pay 20% plus NIC plus pensions. Top whack from the government will be 1,875 cap per month. 31st of October, it's all over. That's the end. What I wanted to say next was related but unrelated to furlough. I'm already receiving a lot of calls and we're already giving a lot of advice on redundancies. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I am sure that is very much on every business's radar. It may be that as one large pub restaurant business that I've been dealing with last week, they have used this, I'm afraid this always happens, as an opportunity to remove those who are more difficult, and we all know who those employees may be. So they are using this as a springboard to remove those who are less useful in the business, and there has never been a better time to do that, to get back to your core business. Or you may genuinely not be able to afford all those you would like to keep, and therefore you are going to have to go through some shredding of that workforce. Bear in mind there are choices. Redundancy is one. Another choice is, could you go for reduction of hours and reduction of pay, possibly across the board or in various sectors of your business? Again, that is something that you can do as long as you carefully manage. That can be fair and lawful. The ways of imposing those changes of reduction in pay, there's a few ways here. There's by agreement, and it is very likely that many employees and workers will be happy to agree to work less. I mean, let's face it, a lot of people are getting very used to working a lot less or not at all. I mean, I've been doing a lot of swimming recently, and the beach has been very crowded, and so the quarter of the workforce is on furlough. They may be happy to go down to 3 days, 2 days, maybe less, a week, but retain employment. So that's agreement. You persuade, they sign up. Again, that thread running through everything, get written consent, because it is a fundamental change of terms and it will be a permanent change to their contract of employment. You may have a business which has trade recognised unions, and it's out there. They need to change those collective agreements. They need to work with the trade unions. What about difficult employees who won't agree? Can you fire and rehire? Oh my goodness, it's like British Airways. Yes, you can. Again, you need to go through a process. You need to go through a proper dismissal process, give notice, and during the notice period, they will be entitled to their current full pay or furlough, whatever they're on. But you then can re-engage on the new terms of probably of less pay and less hours. That again is a process you can do. What about the daring employer who just, that's the way it is, suck it up, next week's hours less pay? Dangerous course, but work. And basically, if those employers carry on working under the new terms, they will deem to have accepted those. So again, that can work. Obviously, I'm a fan of getting written agreement, and if you have a fire and rehire process, that's going to be much more solid and give you better protection. Redundancy, Remember the key elements of redundancy. Why are you making redundancies? You have to show you've got a workplace closure, or you've got less work of a particular kind, or in a particular place, or you are generally reducing numbers of employees. If you're not doing those things, then you're restructuring. You're not making redundancies, you're restructuring. And that can be a fair way of making dismissals, but you may not be actually engaging in the redundancy process, so you may not have to make redundancy payments if you're moving people around. You will have to consult, and you will have to have a fair basis of selection. This is where we are already seeing employers falling down, because, as I mentioned earlier, it's too easy to say, oh, I love Joe blogs, but I hate Josie blogs, so they've always been difficult. Oh, great, we can get rid of them. Be careful, because you may be discriminating, you may be not going through a proper selection process, and you may find yourselves in the tribunal for unfair dismissal. And don't forget, there are no fees for employees to get into the employee tribunal, so it is very easy for them to bring a claim against you, and I've already got a number of new claims that we are dealing with. So take care. Other flag to wave is if you are in a largish SME, you may be considering making redundant more than 20 employees. And even if you're not making 20 employees redundant or dismissing them right now in the next month, you might be doing that within the next 3-month period. And that kicks in a duty of collective consultation. If you do not follow the rules in relation to collective consultation, then in addition to unfair dismissal claims, individual employees can bring a claim for up to 90 days pay each for that failure. So that could be another very expensive penalty, quite separate to an unfair dismissal claim. So again, take care if you think there's a possibility that it's going to be more than 20 employees. And there's another raft if you think there's going to be more than 100 employees that may be going. And I've got a business that I'm dealing with this week who is shutting down a whole area of their retail business connected to the wedding trade. They're just going to shut down that whole business. A lot of those people will be re-engaged in other arms of the business. So don't forget, again, you do have this duty to look at alternative roles if you've got sister companies. So trying not to be too scary, but just trying to give you there a snapshot of what might lie ahead. As I say, related but unrelated to furlough, very useful. However, the furlough period continuing for this length of time up until the end of October means that if you start a process of dismissals for whatever reason now, you can use the furlough period for notice period payments. So that effectively means your notice payments can be subsidised by the government. So be an extra useful at the time. I'm not sure if Tracey's back online, but that's really all I wanted to say at this time. There may be some queries about holiday as well. Again, that's an area we've had a lot of questions on, and I know what many employers now are doing, whether you're furloughed or not, they are saying to employees, you must take 70% of your holiday by the end of September. And that's, again, do it, because you probably do not want everybody taking holiday at once, or having to pay a lot of holiday pay if you are dismissing individuals, because they're accruing holiday all the time, even if they're not working, and you could have another lump sum to pay at the end of the day. So that's it from me for now.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and sorry to jump to you. Seemed the right thing to do.
No problem.
Tracey, I think, had a good old traditional Somerset power cut, so Tracey is now back with us. So Tracey, if it's okay, I'm going to restart the screen share and hand over to you again.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies. It is the first one we've had whilst on lockdown, so can't complain too much. Couldn't have timed it better. So we were just looking at the example. As I say, the complicated period is going to be looking at July. because then it becomes slightly easier in that the employer's NIC and the pension costs don't have to be prorated. But you can see that overall it's intended that staff will still end up with 80% of their furlough pay plus any hours that they work for. So at the bottom you can see how that cost will increase for employers going forwards, and so that will inevitably bring forward redundancies. I think we've all been quite glad that the furlough scheme has taken that decision away from us all to a certain extent, but now we're coming into the harsh reality of making some real decisions going forwards. Right, so on the next slide, we have the unknowns, the usual hours. Now, Kate mentioned that she thought this might be looking at a 12-week average. I do wonder if the way that we've looked at the reference pay may come into play more, rather than just looking at 12 weeks. If you remember, we've got the two categories of workers. One, the salaried worker. What is their normal contracted hours attached to that salary? That's going to be fairly straightforward to deal with, but does overtime come into it? Don't know. On your variable hour workers, I wonder where you've taken the reference pay as a choice between the hire of the pay that they received for the period in the last year, or the average pay up to the point they were furloughed. Are we going to have to look at the hours attached to those two different elements instead? And then that becomes the usual hours. And that might be helpful for 0 hour workers, for example. So again, we don't know, pure speculation, but all we do know is that it's going to make it very complicated and more work for payroll teams. And how will the employer's NIC and pension costs also be apportioned in July? So we will hopefully know more about that this weekend. Moving on to the next one. The conditions under the flexible furlough scheme remain exactly the same. You have to have your UK bank account, or all of the old rules under the JRS scheme. But importantly, you have to have claimed under the JRS in respect of any employees previously furloughed under the JRS. And Kate mentioned that you could bring them back in. They might already have returned to the workplace. If you want to look to reduce hours going forwards, if they've already qualified under the JRS, then you should be able to claim for them under the new scheme. Moving to the next one. So just to remind you, these are key dates. 10th of June, furlough any employees for the first time. If you haven't furloughed at all and you might want to take advantage of the flexible working, furlough again tomorrow to give any employees the key 3 weeks that they need. End of June, last chance if you haven't already submitted your first claim under the retention scheme, and also looking at revising the furlough agreements that you have in place with employees. And apologies, I was offline. I don't know if Kate did cover that or not. At the moment, the furlough agreement will say you are not able to work during furlough. That will change because actually the furlough period will, although you can't work while you're on furlough, you might be furloughed for an hour in a week, so you would be working during a furlough period. 31st of July, last chance to submit and tidy up all of your JRS claims. Moving to the next one. So the claim process will change. I've already said that you will need to finish all of your JRS claims. They will be a tight cut-off at the end of June, no overlap, because from 1st of July, we're into the new scheme. There's a minimum claim period of a week. And again, Kate mentioned about using the scheme a week at a time. just so that there's no confusion here, it's not saying that you have to furlough people for a week at a time. You can work flexibly within that week, but you can only make the minimum claim period is looking at that week, because you're going to have some kind of sensible calculation in looking at what the usual hours are compared with those worked and not worked. And because the scheme is changing at the first of each month, you won't be able to straddle a month end when you're submitting the claim. So that will help the revenue with the checking process, so they know exactly what rules are being applied at any given time. A new requirement is that you're going to have to submit the hours worked and the usual working hours, so that the revenue have that information to hand to check that the calculations look reasonable. The next one's a really important point. Any claim will be capped at the highest number of employees included in any one claim under the job retention scheme. This may be an issue where you've been rotating teams, because if you had one team on, one team off over any month, you're only going to have furloughed half of your workforce at any given time. When you're looking at the claims under the flexible scheme, you will be capped at half of your workforce at any given time. So you won't be able to flex your entire workforce. So again, that might need some action from tomorrow. But you could look at putting people on furlough. But overall, I think you've got to be commercial about all of this. It's got to be a business decision. It can't just be about maximising your claim. It's whether or not you need your workers. And you won't be able to include any employees that you hadn't included a claim for under the retention scheme, and also not if you didn't make a claim before the end of June. Next one. So accounting for any of this grant income, both elements are taxable, chargeable to income tax or corporation tax. You'll include it as income in your profit and loss account, and do not net this against your wages costs. Under normal accounting rules, you don't net income and expenses, so the two should be shown separately. And then move on to the next one, anti-abuse. Whistleblowing. With every new announcement that comes out, the government are reminding employees to ring up, use their helpline, their email address, and report any employers who are abusing this scheme. It's reported that there's already 2,000 fraud investigations ongoing. Reports of employees being told that they have to work, or any of their furlough time is being kept a note of, and the employer will require the employee to work that time at some later date for free, or where the claims are being paid to employers and the employees don't think that they're getting what they have to be paid, because again, a condition of the scheme is that any claim has to be paid to the employee in full without deduction of any fees. The next one. We are being reminded that any claims cannot be abusive, and they can't be contrary to the exceptional purposes of either scheme. Now, again, just to remind you, and Kate mentioned this, it's not just about the economics, it's about the social impact on businesses, employees required not to come into the workplace. So I think that is going to be one of the key things if any of you come under inquiry at a later date. It's not just about whether you should have made a claim economically, it's whether you should have made a claim because of the social impact on your business. The revenue have 6 working days at the moment to check the claim before they make the payment, and then you've got the 6-year record retention, and all of that ties into what's going through under consultation at the moment as to how these checks will be dealt with going forwards. It's going to be brought into the normal inquiry procedure. So all of the normal inquiry windows will apply. the normal assessment time limits, so 4 years where you've taken reasonable care, 6 years where you've not taken reasonable cares, and then up to 20 years to assess you if you've been deliberate or fraudulent in any way. And it's going to be taxed as charging the erroneous part of the claim at 100% to corporation tax or income tax. Penalties will be charged again under the normal inquiry rules, and again they're based on behaviour, whether you're regarded as being taken reasonable care or not, or whether you've behaved deliberately or hidden things in any way. So the top rate of penalty will be 100% of the tax, so the 100% of what you've claimed in error, down to as low as 0% where you've taken reasonable care. And the one tip is document everything. This scheme is constantly changing. We're having guidance updated very frequently. Our understanding is improving every week that goes on. We're making business decisions based on what we know at any point in time. Make a record of those decisions, what you're basing that decision on, what revenue guidance are you using. Keep copies of all of the revenue guidance. As it changes, it's overwritten. So I've been saving PDF copies so I know exactly what's been in place at any point in time. If you're calling the revenue helpline at all, make a record of it, the date, the time that you're speaking with somebody, and retain. The best defence is going to be you've keeping all of those records. And then I think that's it until we get the detail on Friday.
Excellent, thank you. Right. Thanks for jumping back in, Tracey. Again, good detail, slightly mind-bending in places, but good information there. I'm going to run through some of the questions that we've got. Some people have sent me private questions, which is absolutely fine. And if there's anything that is sort of commercially sensitive that you want to send to me rather than the whole group, feel free to select from the little drop-down box, me, Alistair Tudor, from there. So we'll start with the first one, a question around the impending changes. If you return an employee part-time for a period of time, can you then furlough them full-time again afterwards? Kate, I'm going to unmute you. There we go.
There's nothing, I can't see anything to say you can't. So, so I'm assuming the answer is yes. As Tracey was saying, the claim periods have to be at least a week. So you may have to do some working out and timings, but there doesn't appear to be any prevention of you using that full if you need people to work. And so you're not going to be able to use the part-time scheme for all of your workforce. So you may well want to your employees. So I think will definitely be a possibility.
Okay, so that I think makes sense. You know, if you've got somebody that's going to come back work part-time, you've got to fix that for a week, but then you can change the terms of those working hours. So after that, so you've got a minimum of a week rather than 3 weeks. That's fine. Another question: if I need my staff back because work has picked up but they can't come back due to childcare issues, i.e. schools not opening, grandparents unable to help, is it legal for me to keep them on furlough?
Yes.
Yep, quite clear on that one. Another one: if a working employee is advised to self-isolate via track and trace, how should they be categorised for payroll purposes? Should they be furloughed, sick SSP, authorised absence, holiday, etc.?
Oh, that's a good question, because we've got no updated guidance on the track and trace yet. But the way it's worked to date is you can't be both on sick leave and on furlough, but you can fairly much choose which is better for the employee in terms of reward. Quite be furlough, because that's going to be 80%. SSP is very low, but then what if they're entitled to contractual sick pay? So I suspect that's going to fall in of being allowed to be. Again, there's no guidance on that as yet.
Okay, Kate, I'm just going to stop
Oh,
you.
I've lost you.
It's okay. I can still hear you,
Yeah.
Kate. Your line was a bit breaking up there, so
Okay.
I'm just going to stop the video and
Yeah.
see if, that improves it. What's next? If we currently claim employers NIC, sorry, can we currently claim employers NIC if we receive employers allowance?
No, it's one or the other. So we've been advising, and it's consistent with the Institute's advice, that the employment allowance is turned off until after furlough.
Okay, thank you, nice and clear. Again, a question around the agreement, I think, moving forward. If an employee remains on furlough for a couple of months, do I have to write to them again to confirm that they remain on furlough, or is a single letter enough? I guess the obvious point is it depends what was included in that single original letter. I think if you've got a timescale detailed, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, Kate, but if you've got a timescale that's detailed in the original letter, yes, you would need to do it. If it's an ongoing arrangement, unless the conditions of that furlough are changing, i.e. you're changing their working hours, you'd be okay with the original letter, Kate?
You probably don't need a sign-up agreement, but clarity is always really important, because remember, under the general employment law, if there's any ambiguity in the terms of the relationship, the benefit of a doubt will always fall to the employee. So if you're not being clear, you're in danger of an unlawful deduction claim.
Okay. Again, I've just stopped your video, Kate. Sorry, don't take it personally.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you can get it in writing, make it nice and clear.
Yeah.
Fairly straightforward advice. Yeah. If a business is having to make redundancies, and I think there are a few questions around redundancies here. So if a business is having to make redundancies and consultation completes mid-July, can an employer continue to furlough until the end of July and pay notice at the end of July, providing the contract allows PILION? Presumably notice needs to be paid at full pay and not furlough pay.
So in reverse order, yes. Nearly always notice pay will have to be full pay, 100%. But yes, you can use the furlough period. Yes, you can dictate when notice is running from and to. In terms of the slightly strange rule on notice pay, if you have an individual who has more contractual notice than the legal requirement, then you may be able to just pay them the furlough pay for the notice. So for example, you've got someone who's only been with you 1 year, but you give them 1 month's notice in their contract. Legally, you only have to give them 1 week's notice. So you're giving them a longer period than you have to, and therefore you could pay them just furlough pay for the notice period. That would be possible. But most people will fall into the category of being entitled to 100% pay for notice period weeks. But you can control when those weeks are if you're still employing them throughout. If you're going to cut them off and say go now, then you're going to have to pay the notice in full, and furlough's not going to help you. So use furlough while you can.
Yeah, so just for clarity then, if somebody's contractual agreement is longer than the furlough period at the moment, you'd have to top up that furlough 80%, 100%. If it's shorter, i.e. I know you're giving 6 weeks notice instead of a month's notice, that full pay period is effectively topped up by furlough, so it's a greater amount?
It's nothing really to do with furlough, this strange rule. It's to do with what the contract of employment says and their length of service. So it's slightly confusing, but it's unusual for that to happen. Although a lot of new employees, quite often employers will give them this month notice from, say, 3 months service in, so that may apply. With the furlough, the basic rule is use the furlough. That can be used as notice period. You're likely to have to top it up to 100% when you call that furlough period notice period.
Okay.
Any queries, come to me.
Yeah, I think that's it. And any individual.
Yeah, because there will be strange situations.
Yeah, it'll add nuance to what the advice is here. So, you know, feel free to contact Kate.
Yeah.
Your sound did go a little bit patchy at the end of your piece. No, it's all right. Your main piece rather than the question seems okay now. There was a question around the opportunity for redundancy pays to be subsidised if notice falls during the furlough period. I think we've covered that, but if the person that's answered that question, Rob, you put it in the main chat. So if anybody, you know, if you wanted further clarity on that one, I'm sure Kate will be able to.
Yeah.
Slightly different question. Is there any information for a second claim for self-employed people on the SEISS?
Only in that it's been extended by another 3 months, and that in line with the furlough scheme, it's going down to 70% of the profit figure. Before it was 80% of the profit figure, and that will be it. A one-off claim which you can make from 1st of August, I believe.
Okay, and is it applying to the same period as last time, or have they shifted it all to the corresponding period over the month?
Yeah, so it's moved on 3 months, and it will end at the end of September, I believe. Okay. Yeah, so slightly sooner than the furlough scheme.
Fine. Okay, thank you. And another question here: if, as a result of an agreed reduction to pay rates, agreed in writing, presumably notice period will be calculated at new lower rate.
Yes, if they've agreed to that change. Bear in mind if you're forcing a change through, but if they've agreed, yes, it's all change. New pay rates, new hours, notice applies to that. If you've had to force the change through, then you're going to have to give notice of that change, and therefore you're going to have to pay the full rate up to the change date that you've now imposed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we've come to the end of the questions that are in the chat. I'm presuming that there's not further ones, so I'll bring us to a close. We will circulate this video and also the presentation that Tracey had with the details in there. I know it's going to take probably a couple of reads to kind of get heads around, and obviously you have contact details there for both Tracey and Kate in that presentation. Just a couple of blatant plugs for the chamber. We've got an event which is on tomorrow, which is a kind of an open networking. They've actually proved quite popular. They're called Let's Network. You can find details of those on the website, and I'll make sure that when Brooke sends around the email after this event, you've got a link for that if you wanted to join us. They are quite informal, quite fun. And we've also got a sector focus event on Thursday the 18th. That's around food and drink. So if you know anybody that's within the food and drink sectors, not necessarily hospitality, we're doing separate ones for those, but food and drink producers that could benefit from that sort of event and sharing some knowledge, please do let us know. Some key kind of takeaways from this is as Kate says, and indeed Tracey says, record everything, get it in writing. So if you're going to change the terms of the agreement, get that confirmed and reissue those. It's interesting to see about that kind of capping of furlough numbers as well. You know, if you've been rotating your staff and you've had 50% off at any one time, you know, you can't then exceed that. So that's interesting stuff. I will close this to an end. Once again, thank you ever so much for all of you coming. Really appreciate you coming along and taking advantage of this. Feel free to give us any feedback. It's always really appreciated, and the team I know at the Somerset Chamber are working very hard to put these on. So if you've got any nice words for them, please do include those as well. And obviously, thank you very much to Tracey from Albert Goodman and to Kate Gardner from Clarke Willmott as well. Really good. Thank you very much.
Apologies for the internet.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.